So let me introduce you to CASCADIA. The purpose of this video will be to briefly and casually, if you like, introduce you to CASCADIA, and then to go through a patch I used for a rendition of Avril 14th by Aphex Twin, where I run down the specific patch that I multitrack layered with CASCADIA for its release. If you haven't seen that video, go check it out in the description, and here's a little bit of it. So before we get into patch specifics, let's just run down what CASCADIA is, and my tone-boosting, power-filled fake pot plants. CASCADIA is a semi-modular, fully Eurorack-compatible, very versatile, feature-packed synth. We have two oscillators, one more comprehensive than the other, a comprehensive mix section with subs, noise, ring modulation, line level inputs that we can mix in, a comprehensive filter with plenty of modulation inputs, attenuators and attenuators there as well, lots of different filter types, a wave folder, two VCAs, one that we can turn into a pseudo low-pass gate, this really kind of Eurorack heavy power user manipulator of the voltage friendly utility belt, as I'm calling it, that has sample and hold, an envelope follower and slew, a mix verter where you can mix in and offset voltages, attenuate them, attenuvert them, a comprehensive LFO that has multiple outputs, three active mults. We have an expression source which you can actually feed out to pedals. We'll come to effects and pedal integration shortly. Ring mod, that secondary VCA, and then we have two envelope generators, one standard ADSR with added hold and some end of outputs and modulation. And we also have envelope B, which is a function generator that can be an LFO, burst, more standard two-stage envelope, again with lots of modulation. We get MIDI, and I'll put an image on screen of the back of this for DIN MIDI in, out, through, USB-C MIDI, and then the MIDI and CV section here with pitch, velocity, and MIDI CC, MIDI mod, an inbuilt MIDI LFO, gate, trigger, and a MIDI clock, all of which you can configure. You can also configure an alternative noise source, which has things like vinyl crackle, cymbal style noises, and there's a converter app that you can just really easily set this up with and kind of customize the behavior. We have pedal integration with send and return levels, line level, pedal level, instrument switching, phase inversion, which can be really handy, effects blending, and then we have this main output section where we can sum two signals, drive them if you wish, change the clip behaviors, and then we have main outs, headphone outs, and a Eurorack out too. That's a really quick kind of overview of the synth. And let's just run down that patch and get some ideas of how CASCADIA sounds and what I was doing with it. This was played via MIDI and coming in over USB. Here it is playing the accompanying line, as opposed to the melody. You're currently listening to a sine wave coming through the filter, through the VCA and some effects. And I felt important to integrate the effects, even though the mix was really low as I wanted the raw sound to come through well on the video. Adding in some richer waves, cranking the effects. I felt it was important to show that you can integrate both line level and instrument or pedal level effects right here on CASCADIA. It's an analog delay pedal in this case from Way Huge, with little return level and kind of 20% wet if that. It's just that splash of colour in the background. And I'll also say there's a little bit of Valhalla Supermassive, literally 4% wet on the mix, just for kind of a long ambience in the distance. Just add some depth to the recording that I felt quite nice, that still didn't detract from the raw tone here. Now throughout the performance, I was mainly playing with mixer levels, fading in different VCOA waves into this filter, which give us all those lovely East Coast classic subtractive sounds. But one thing I really like with CASCADIA is that kind of clashing of East Coast and West Coast, or rather the marriage and kind of harmony of the two at the same time. was leaning into those more dissonant, experimental West Coast tones with both ring modulation and through zero frequency modulation. If I just bring up the ring mod, which is here, and normals into this mixer, you can hear it's particularly clangorous. And that's because VCO A and B modulate against each other, but VCO B isn't tracking pitch. It handily has a switch to do so if I switch this in, we get more conventionally musical tones. I'm playing with the octaves. There's lots of nice musical ring mod to be had, but by not tracking pitch, you get this pitch moving oscillator beating into this one that isn't tracking pitch. And that against, say, just a sine wave, just adds this kind of organic weirdness that I really enjoy. I was also leaning into that kind of West Coastness, weirdness, dissonance, whatever you want to call it, with the through zero modulation. If I turn up the index, VCO B will modulate the through zero FM of VCO A. And it's much more subtle than the ring mod. More apparent on, say, the pulse, which also has some modulated LFO, modulated modulation, PWM going on, adding in the sub. By bringing the filter down, there's just this liveliness to the sound. It's just kind of hiding in there. It's lively and interesting. Again, you can emphasize with ring mod. Going back to just the sine wave there, the main thing that was happening was kind of patching around this utility belt, as I'm calling it. We'll start with the first channel on the mult, which is taking MIDI trigger and splitting that two ways, one to go back and trigger my sample and hold, rather than letting it clock via MIDI. I want it to trigger per note rather than actually clock with a steady clock. I'm using that into the mult as well, which we'll come back to, but also using this trigger split into the envelope B. I wanted the function generator to be triggered in behaviour rather than gated. Bringing in the sample and hold, this is sampling white noise via the note trigger, coming into the mult, and that's splitting to modulate the filter, which we'll listen to on a saw wave. I'll turn up its attenuator and some resonance. It's randomly jumping around all over the place. Even though it's random, I do quite like it, but attenuators and attenuators, which Cascadia has plenty of, allows to add some of this organic randomness, which is really an essential part of patching for me. And just keeping it really subtle, more like a humanizing effect than what we might actually think of as random. I then have MIDI velocity coming into the third mult, and I'm using that to control the second VCA, which I'll come to in a second, and the length of envelope B. So the length of filter modulation changes as does the volume of my sound, trying to mimic acoustic instruments, where if you hit something harder or strike a string harder with more velocity, you tend to get longer and louder notes. And less force and energy putting by the player, you get quieter, softer, duller notes. So going on to that second VCA, all of the sound from this mixer is coming out via this cable into the mixer, and it's that MIDI velocity. I'll overlay an image of this MIDI velocity so you can see it, which is controlling the level. Nothing else happens here, as it's the envelope and VCA A later in the signal path that controls the main shape of the notes. So by using a second VCA, I take all of my main core sounds, adjust their level via MIDI velocity. This could easily be a sequence from Eurorack or something else. And then I'm patching back into the filter. So I hit the filter with a more dynamic signal controlled via that MIDI velocity. The filter comes through to the main input here on the main VCA, which is what's going through my outputs and into the effects. But one other thing we can do is kind of create a multi-layered effect by fading in the folder. And it almost sounds like a secondary layer. If I bring down the filter, and we just look at that folder, it folds VCOA's sine. And I'm using the envelope, my main envelope A, to modulate the fold level. So a tiny bit of that against this filter, taking the richer waves. We start to push into this multi-layered, you could call it multiphonic, I guess. We can invert this envelope behavior. And play around with the behaviors and the levels of the sounds. I'm also using the LFO here, patching in some modulation from the MIDI LFO, which is a really nice bonus to have. And you can see that's making the LFO wobble around. That's modulating pulse width and is also modulating my envelope B. So those are the main parts of the patch, the integration of effects there, using the MIDI trigger for sample and hold and getting randomness into the patch, kind of pushing East Coast and West Coast synthesis ideas against each other in a nice harmonious musical way to my ear, and using that second VCA for MIDI velocity to actually create a dynamic mix and blend that's musical and changing over time, that then goes through the filtering and VCA and the rest of the signal path. Hope that's given you some ideas of how to make the most of Cascadia and start patching with it. Do let me know what you'd like to see with Cascadia. More videos are coming, so leave a comment and let me know what you'd like to see, specific features, more of it in depth, more musical examples. And if you haven't heard it yet, go listen to the full, it's only 2 minutes long, Avril 14th rendition on Cascadia. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you next time. Bye.